Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here today. I'd like to extend some appreciation to QED for having us on the panel, and to not just the attendees here, but also the panelists. It's really encouraging to see representatives from the industry here at Port of Rotterdam, from Parliament, from the Council, from the Commission, and other various stakeholders, frankly, engaged in a conversation around what is, of course, a very important topic. I am based in London. I've been with Platts for about 18 years or so, and in my time I've worked in the European markets, right at the very beginning, actually. In Houston, looking at the Americas markets for gas and electricity. In Singapore, looking at the oil markets for North Asia, Southeast Asia. And now I'm back in London again, looking after the global oil markets for Platts. And part of my job is to make sure that the oil benchmarks we publish, indeed all of the oil assessments we publish, are credible, meaningful, robust, representative of the markets that we cover. A concern that I have every day, a concern that I know all of you share when you look at the values being published by benchmarks. I'm based in London, but I'm an American citizen, so on my earlier topic, I just want to say, really apropos of nothing in particular, but just to acknowledge, it's great to see government engaging on such an important topic so proactively following the elections last night. I'm not sure I'll ever see this level of engagement again in the U.S. In my lifetime. So it's encouraging, and in the past few days, it's been encouraging to hear the nature of the conversation around benchmarks and the preparedness to engage on the topic. Benchmarks play an important role in our lives. Whether we use interest rate benchmarks to help us understand the level at which we should be borrowing money, the level at which we pay it back to banks, the level at which they lend among themselves, whether it's real estate and property benchmarks, which people may use to understand where to build new apartments, new housing, what rate to rent them out at, perhaps what rate to purchase them at. Foreign exchange benchmarks, which give us an idea the relative values between different currencies around the world and the import that has for our transactions internationally and domestically. And of course, among the many other kinds of benchmarks out there, commodity benchmarks, which are essential to companies that are trying to understand whether to buy jet fuel for delivery to Europe, for delivery to the Middle East, for delivery to Asia, whether to store it, resupply it, and what have you. We've heard today quite a few times a very important thought. Are financial benchmarks and commodity benchmarks in fact the same? I actually have three messages I wanted to share with all of you today on the topic of the panel and in my allotted 10 minutes. And one of the critical ones is that financial benchmarks and commodity benchmarks are not in fact the same. And actually, as I hear the conversation played out, I hear recognition of that even from those who state at the outset that they in fact believe that they are. Let me tell you why commodity benchmarks are not the same as financial benchmarks. They're not the same for the same reason that you wouldn't go to a bank to fill up your car, that you don't call your broker to make sure that there's jet fuel in your airplane. Commodity benchmarks represent the transactional activity between hundreds of companies, some of the largest companies in the world, all the way through to some of the smallest companies in the world, that are buying and selling, supplying, producing, and consuming crude oil, raw materials, gasoline, diesel, moving them within jurisdictions, across jurisdictions, into and out of France, into and out of Germany, into and out of the EU. Those hundreds of companies that are trading that physical oil or physical copper or physical natural gas are bringing those materials in to areas that they're needed to be consumed and taking them away from areas where they are available in superabundance and oversupply. This is the nature of the trading business. The transactions in the commodity markets are very different to the transactions in the financial markets. They are heterogeneous, a phrase or a word that we hear a lot of. But it's worth spending a moment on this topic because I get asked the question a lot. We've heard the question a lot this week. How are these things different? How are financial benchmarks different to commodity benchmarks? When we say commodity transactions are heterogeneous, what we mean are when a company is looking to buy or sell a barge of jet fuel in Rotterdam or Amsterdam, ultimately for supply to Schiphol or some other airport, they may need to have it delivered to them 2 weeks from now, 1 month from now, next week. They may be looking for 2,000 tons of that, 5,000 tons of that. Maybe they want 40,000 tons of that. They may be looking for aviation-grade jet fuel or some other kind of jet kerosene for cutting into the heating stock. They're different qualities, different sizes, different delivery times. Not only are the transactions themselves very different in nature to each other between markets, they're very different within markets as well. These are not simply interest rate transactions, look-alike transactions happening on computer screens thousands of times an hour, a minute, a day, whatever it is. These are unique transactions in physically deliverable commodities. They also represent the activities of hundreds of companies, maybe even more than that. Many of these companies don't just differ in size, they differ in jurisdiction. The great majority of companies that are trading in commodities are not subject to European Union supervision. They're not subject to any supervision, whether that makes Europe comfortable or not. These are the Russian companies. These are the Indian companies, the Mexican companies, the American companies, and yes, of course, German companies, French companies, Italian companies. But not all of these companies, in fact, the great majority of them don't have oversight from a European authority. And all of these companies are supplying transactional data to price reporting agencies on a completely voluntary basis. In fact, there are as many reasons to not supply this data to a PRA as there are to supply this data to a PRA. One more reason not to supply this data to a PRA may be the reason that that data stops getting supplied at all. Physical commodity benchmarks are not the same as financial benchmarks, quod erat demonstrandum, in the theme of the conference today. And I hear that reflected back in the comments from people who even assert that they are at the outset, which is actually very heartening to me. So perhaps we can move beyond that. But since that's an important topic, I wanted to address it at the outset. Now, two other points from me. Benchmarks are critically important. Indeed, as well as being used at the heart of the commodity markets, there are some commodity benchmarks that have financially settled derivatives associated with them. Agreed. And in fact, even if there weren't, it is completely fair to ask yourself the question, as we've been asking ourselves for 103 years, how can we be sure that the benchmarks we publish to the marketplace, that the reference prices we provide to our customers and other interested parties, how can we be sure that they represent a reality? How can we be sure that they are consistent with market value? I think that's an important question to ask yourself. And this is why we were so happy to get engaged with the IOSCO process, Committee 7, back in 2010, discussing the nature of commodity benchmarks and the ways that companies, the providers of those benchmarks, can move beyond pure reputation. It's interesting to hear them talk about reputation earlier this afternoon. Actually, the reputation of commodity benchmarks is pretty compelling. But we recognize valuable to move beyond just reputation and demonstrate the many ways that commodity benchmarks can show credibility and fit for purpose, and that they are aligned with market value. These principles are captured in the IOSCO principles for oil price reporting agencies, and we were asked in 2012, as they were passed to the industry, to not just apply those to oil benchmarks, to other commodity benchmarks as well. And we have gone ahead and done so, because we agree that commodity markets, not just oil markets, but all commodity markets, share these characteristics in common that make them, yes, benchmarks, but also quite different from financially driven benchmarks. We've applied these principles over the past 2 years. We've done 2 external audits, as have other PRAs. I represent Platts. Other PRAs are available. I'm pleased to see a number of them in the crowd with us today. They are audited. Our performance against those principles are audited by a third party. We publish those results on our website. We did it last year. We did it again this year. We'll do it again next year. And IOSCO reported in September of this year, just 6 or 7 weeks ago, but sometimes I think people have forgotten this, that not just the market stakeholders have expressed satisfaction with the progress that PRAs have made in aligning with these principles and the confidence they bring in the benchmarks themselves, but also that the principles for PRAs should in fact remain distinct from the IOSCO principles for financial benchmarks. Because commodity benchmarks are financial benchmarks, not just because I'm here trying to convince you of that today, but because the people who have taken the time from the regulatory community to analyze that question have also arrived at the same conclusion. Thirdly, for me, my second point was to stress the value of the IOSCO principles for price reporting agencies and that we've applied them to all commodity markets, not just oil. Thirdly, for me, if I can make my screen skip here, I wanted to talk a little bit about, thank you, the unintended consequences of scaling the financial benchmarks regulation into commodities, mushing them together so they all look the same, however you want to put this. There are significant potential unintended consequences here. The requirement for sources to either sign or somehow abide by an unsigned code of conduct could well be that reason that drives those hundreds of companies that supply us with transactional data into the long grass. It was a great point earlier today. If there's no traffic on the road, you can have somebody trying to measure the speed at which the traffic is passing, but there's no traffic to measure, right? These are not regulated markets. You cannot compel companies to trade oil in Europe. You certainly can't compel them to report their transactions under current statutes anyways to anybody, never mind a transactional repository or a PRA. This is especially true for market participants that are outside the EU, but I don't believe participants that are inside the EU will be willing to abide by code of conducts either. Now, this is not to say that we don't have, through the IOSCO principles and our own methodologies, very high standards for the data we will accept and publish and consider in our price benchmarks. We have those standards explained. Our other PRA competitors do as well. We expect the data to stand by that. We publish the data we use into the marketplace so that participants and interested parties can be sure that the data does live up to that standard. Of course, there have to be standards for data, but a punitive code of conduct that carries penalties associated with it is one more risk that a voluntary provider of information will probably, in fact, almost certainly, be unwilling to take on board. Smaller participants don't have the structures or can handle the costs that come with these submitter requirements, not just code of conduct. Concepts like back office, which prevent the validation, testing of data, also introduce an unlevel playing field, an uneven environment for the smaller companies that make up huge components of the Rotterdam market, as we'll hear shortly, of the European market in general. And they simply may elect out rather than take on that extra cost of providing data into a benchmark. And as we've heard today earlier, and I'll just leave it with this, third-party provisions in the proposal at the EC, the various iterations at the moment, aren't aligned either with the IOSCO principles for oil PRAs. We've heard that they're similar. They are not the same. Neither are they aligned with global standards for benchmarks. And this is a very serious issue. I'm asked over and over again, well, what's your idea? Well, my idea is we have principles in place that, yes, can be encoded in regulation. I hear what you're saying on that. But those principles are 2 years into maturity. They're demonstrating value to the marketplace. They are there for the global markets to align around. Voluntarily setting a bar even higher than that may be leadership, but it may also be going up a tree and pulling a ladder behind you. There could be migration of benchmarks away from EU-regulated markets, and we could have a balkanizing effect on benchmarks. I'll leave you with the thought, would you wish to have an EU-qualified benchmark on the one hand and a global benchmark on the other? I'm not so sure you would, but that's something to consider as you think about the draft legislation in the region. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to take part. I'm happy to see government in action successfully in this jurisdiction. I wish there was some in DC, and I look forward to the questions.